Hello, my friends. Hello, and welcome once again to stately Vaughan Manor, where we're going to be talking about one of my favorite writers of all time, Richard Matheson. Richard Matheson, who wrote a bunch of great books, one of the most influential horror writers of all time, but he also wrote science fiction, he wrote fantasy, he wrote westerns, he wrote crime fiction, he wrote all kinds of stuff, Richard Matheson did, and he didn't just write stories and books. No, he also wrote teleplays, he wrote for television, and he also wrote screenplays for movies. He did it all, Richard Matheson. But it is his books which probably are his most significant works. Richard Matheson, who was born February 20th, 1926, passed away on June 23rd, 2013. It still doesn't seem very long ago when he passed away. Richard Matheson. So, he wrote two of the most important horror novels of all time. He wrote a bunch of really intriguing books. So we're going to talk about his work today. We're not going to talk about all of his work, but I'm going to talk about his most significant work. Because he wrote some tremendous stuff. And like I said, really influential guy. And I think he was the most influential on the horror genre. Because he changed horror. Horror, before Richard Matheson's time, was most familiar from writers like Edgar Allan Poe, H.P. Lovecraft, Algernon Blackwood. Writers like that. The kinds of stories you'd find in Weird Tales. But what Richard Matheson did is he took horror and he put it into the lives of ordinary people. He would put horror in a world that was recognizable. Our world, the world that we live in. He put horror into that world, so someplace that we could really relate to. And he is the writer who is probably the most influential, well, almost certainly the most influential on Stephen King, who has become known as the king of horror, Stephen King. Certainly one of the most important horror writers of all time. But if you were to read Stephen King's volume of short stories, his first volume of short stories, Night Shift, you can certainly see the influence of Richard Matheson. Those stories, a couple of them seem like Richard Matheson could have wrote them. The influence is very strong, something that Stephen King would tell you. He has spoken before about how influential Richard Matheson was on his own work. And he talks about it in his own book, Dance Macabre. He has a chapter where he talks about Richard Matheson and Richard Matheson's book, The Shrinking Man. But if you are new to Richard Matheson, let's say you've never read a Richard Matheson book, but you've heard about him, where would you start? I think you should start with his short stories. And the one book that I would get, the one book I would read before I read anything else, is a book that is fortunately very easy to find. I did a whole video on it. It's the Penguin volume, The Best of Richard Matheson. And that's not an exaggeration. This book really is the best of Richard Matheson. This has most of his greatest stories in it. So this will give you a feel for the power of his writing. Just great stories of horror and suspense and fantasy. Dynamite stuff. A lot of his stories were written in the 50s and the 60s. Some of his stories do show their age, but it doesn't really matter because they're just so great. So yeah, this book right here, that is the book I would start with. Just an amazing book. There are a couple other volumes out there. There is Nightmare at 20,000 Feet, which is an excellent collection of horror stories from Tor, I believe. Now you might recognize that title from the Twilight Zone. Richard Matheson was one of the writers that Rod Serling brought in to write episodes of the Twilight Zone. a few of them based on his own stories, his own short stories that he turned into Twilight Zone episodes. But they are dynamite as short stories. Just excellent stuff. And the Twilight Zone, that's a very Richard Matheson kind of show, because Richard Matheson wrote stories for it, and they're the type of stories that he would write, because he was writing at the same time as Ray Bradbury and Harlan Ellison and some other important writers. And they were all writing some really important stuff as far as horror and science fiction and fantasy were concerned. And so this is an excellent book because this title story is excellent. And also another excellent volume of short stories is Duel, Terror Stories by Richard Matheson. More great horror stories. But again, both those stories, Duel and Nightmare at 20,000 Feet, they're both in that Penguin volume. So that Penguin volume is probably the one volume to go to for his short stories if you just want to get a taste of what Richard Matheson is all about. And once you've done that, you can move on to his great books. So let's talk about his great novels. So let's talk about some of his novels. Some of his major novels, some of his novels that were not so major. Now, he started out writing some suspense crime stuff. The one that sticks out in my mind is Fury on Sunday, which was written in 1953. And it's a crime story. It's a suspense story. But it's really kind of a relationship drama with a dangerous lunatic. Well worth checking out. And this was reprinted, and I think you can get this on Audible. There are ways that you can get this. You can get this as an ebook. So it's out there and it's available. It probably wouldn't be the first novel I would read from Richard Matheson, but if you find yourself particularly intrigued by this author, as I am, it's definitely worth checking out. He also wrote a couple other crime novels from in around that same period in the early 50s. But it was in 1954 when he wrote one of his most important books, a book that has been incredibly influential on the horror genre, and that would be I Am Legend. I Am Legend. One of my favorite horror novels of all time. There are so many things that are great about this book. As a reading experience, it's just fantastic. I remember reading this the first time in a beat up old paperback, and I think I read it all in like a day. It's not very long. I have a very nice edition of it right up here from the Folio Society, but it's readily available as an ebook or a paperback, and you should read it. Very important as a vampire story, early vampire novel, and it could be the first novel where the vampire is taken out of his supernatural background and placed in a science fiction story, because this is also science fiction. This gives you a scientific explanation for the vampire. But that doesn't make it any less horrifying. This is a really scary book, actually. And it's also very effective because here you have Richard Matheson doing what he does best. You have a man alone faced with this terrifying situation which he has to handle on his own. He is the last human being on Earth, as far as he knows, in a world that has been transformed into a world of vampires. Everybody's a vampire except for him, the hero of this story. And he has to board up his house and stay in the house, which has been boarded up so the vampires don't get in and kill him. And then during the day, he goes out and kills the vampires. It's a great story with some great moments in it, some touching moments, some moments that really make you think. It explores what will happen to a person when they're just alone too long. And this character, he's just alone too long. And what that'll do to your psychology and how that might change you as a person. So many great things about this book. But we will go on. Just trust me, you're going to want to read this one. So let's move on to his next really, really important book, which was written in 1956, and that's The Shrinking Man. The Shrinking Man, a science fiction novel, which is also really a horror novel. The Shrinking Man is such an important book. And it also has the theme of a man alone up against a terrifying situation, because every day the hero of this story shrinks just a little bit. Every day he's just a little bit smaller. He had gone through a radioactive cloud on his boat, and it affected him in this way. And he goes to doctors, and nobody can help him. He just keeps shrinking every day. And which is really terrifying, because this guy is literally facing oblivion. He's going to shrink down to literally nothing eventually. And it explores what will happen to a person when this happens. You have this guy who not only becomes shorter and shorter, but he starts losing everything in his life. As he becomes smaller and smaller, his wife and child start treating him differently, right? They're starting to lose respect for him. They don't mean to, but they just kind of naturally do. And so he loses his power and his agency in his own life. The world becomes more and more dangerous to him, until finally his life is a fight for survival every day. It's something, man. And the way it was written was so tremendously effective. Very influential and important book in science fiction and in horror. But despite that, it probably isn't read as often as it should be. I don't hear it talked about as much as his other book, I Am Legend. That's kind of understandable. But The Shrinking Man really is every bit as good, and it probably tackles the theme of alienation maybe even better than I Am Legend does. That's a tough call, but maybe. Now, in 1958, he also wrote a book called A Stir of Echoes. A Stir of Echoes, which takes a classic ghost story and puts it in the life of an ordinary man. Really effective ghost story, actually, and one quite a bit different than most that had been written up to this point. After this, you've seen this kind of thing a lot, but up to this point in the late 50s, there wasn't too much of this kind of story out there, where you have a supernatural ghost story, and it's put in the life of an average person. It starts off as a guy experiencing these supernatural events, but are they supernatural, or is there something else going on? Have to read it. It was made into a fairly decent movie, from what I remember, but definitely another book to check out. Now, a book that I haven't read, and I really need to, is in 1960, he wrote a book called The Beardless Warriors, which is a war novel based on his own experiences in World War II. I don't know why I've never read this book. I have it. I love the writer, so it's kind of a mystery to me why I haven't read it. So I've got to prioritize this and read it soon. It is something that I wanted to mention, though, even though I haven't read it. If only because it is a lesser-known work from Richard Matheson. And frankly, not enough people talk about war novels, actually. You don't see much of it, I think, on BookTube. Books that focus on, say, the First or Second World War. And this one, like I said, is based on his own experiences, so it's got to be pretty interesting. So I look forward to that. The next novel I'm going to be talking about is actually one of his best, and that is Hell House from 1971. This takes the basic theme of Shirley Jackson's Hill House, The Haunting of Hill House, and kind of ramps up the horror in 1971's Hell House. There are a lot of things I like about this book. However, I have to admit, some things in this book have not aged particularly well. Like I said, it really ramps up the horror from The Haunting of Hill House, Shirley Jackson's book. You have basically the same situation where you have people going to this haunted house to research it, and much more horrifying and disturbing things happen in this book. But it also occasionally veers into being a little over the top. And I think actually Shirley Jackson's book has aged a lot better than Hell House has. I think probably because Shirley Jackson's book, The Haunting of Hill House, isn't over the top. It has a fairly serious theme. The supernatural events are more understated. I just think it's aged better. And Hell House does have some weaknesses, which it's always had. But probably the whole novel worked better in 1971 than it does now. The ending, for example, is an ending that you might have been able to get away with in 71. I'm not sure even in 71 you could have really gotten away with it, but you could get away with it a lot better than you can now. For one thing, the relationships between the characters just seem really out of date. And we've had so many real terrifying haunted house stories. The Shining from Stephen King comes to mind, that are more horrifying, and a couple of them are just frankly a lot better. Still, well worth reading, Hell House is, I think. Just, yeah, it's a bit creaky at this point, Hell House. Then he moved on to some different kinds of stuff, some more fantasy kind of things. Bid Time Return from 1975, which was filmed as Somewhere in Time, that came out in 1980, and I think the book has since become known as Somewhere in Time, but Bid Time Return was how it started. About a guy who has a terminal brain tumor, and he goes to this hotel to kind of get away from it all, and through a set of circumstances, which I will not spoil for you because it's frankly a really good book, he falls in love with a woman in the past, manages to travel to the past, where he meets the woman that he fell in love with, and he has a relationship with her, and it's really interesting the way it's done. The time travel business is a little, but there's a reason for it. The way Richard Matheson did this, he wrote, frankly, a kind of touching, tragic story. And by the end of it, the way he writes it, you don't know if it really happened or not. Was it all due to his brain tumor? You have to read the story, but it's well worth reading. I think it's frankly a really good book. I don't think it's one of his best, but I think it's really good. Then we have to talk about What Dreams May Come from 1978. This book about life and love after death has become one of his better known books, in part because of the film. The film actually in some ways was probably better than the book, although I didn't particularly care for the book or the film really. There's some things about this book. It deals with the afterlife, and the way it's done just never really struck me as... I was not convinced. Let's just put it that way. So it didn't work for me particularly well, this book. But there are a lot of people who absolutely adore this book. I don't know... I don't believe in the afterlife or anything like that. And so perhaps it was just this particular vision of the afterlife, which I just found, frankly, silly. Maybe that is my own bias to this kind of thing, but it just didn't work the way like a supernatural ghost story would. But like I said, this is a book a lot of people seem to like, and so I probably should revisit it. I was pretty young when I read this, so I don't know. I probably should give it another shot, but I have to mention it. It is one of those books that people seem to like an awful lot for the most part. I think a much, much better book came in 1992 with Journal of the Gun Years. Richard Matheson wrote some westerns, and I think this was his best one. I frankly think this is one of his best books. It's not up there with The Shrinking Man or I Am Legend, but it's a really dark book. It's a really dark, really intense western, and a really good western novel. So I definitely would recommend this Journal of the Gun Years. If you ever see a copy of this book, pick it up. He wrote some other stuff. He wrote 7 Steps to Midnight in 1993. This was a suspense novel, which has the feel of some of his early short stories. I think this story would have worked more effectively if it had been a short story. I don't think as a novel everything really works in this. I think there are some issues with this novel. Whether it works for you or not depends on whether you find the explanation of what happens, where you have this guy and his life is literally stolen from him, and he is put through some very dangerous, he runs into some very dangerous situations, the main character of this book. But it's the type of story where things keep happening to this character, and the character doesn't particularly make things happen. Another book I should probably revisit. It's got very mixed reviews. Some people love it, some people don't love it. I don't think it has the power of his earlier work, but I thought it should be mentioned. Shadow on the Sun from 1994 is another thing entirely. This is another book which I thought was a straight Western novel when I read it. I read it for June on the Range last year. But reading it, I was surprised to find out that it is actually a horror novel, and a good one. So we have a mixture of a Western and a horror novel, Shadow on the Sun. It's not his best Western, it's not his best horror novel, but the elements in this combine to make a very effective story. And the horror moments are pretty well done. It helps that it's short. So it's a shorter novel. And as a short novel, it works really well. Like I said, it's not his best, but pretty effective. And I do recommend this one. Finally, we have to talk, I guess, about Hunted Past Reason from 2002. Probably his last big suspense novel. This was about the worst camping trip of all time. Probably, well, I'm not going to say probably, certainly is his most disturbing book, Richard Matheson's. About this guy that goes on a 3-day hike with the wrong person. They're hiking up to this guy's cabin, this guy and his friend is, well, he's a lunatic. Wouldn't you know it, it's a Richard Matheson story. So yeah, there's a lunatic involved and terrible things happen. It becomes a fight for survival. Really disturbing stuff happening. And in some ways, it's a very effective suspense novel, but in other ways, I feel it falls short. Not everything works in this. Neither one of the characters on this hike are particularly likable. Even the guy that even the main character isn't particularly. And it just, not everything particularly works for me in this book. So it's not a book. Again, if you're particularly intrigued by Richard Matheson as a writer, yeah, give this book a shot, see what you think. I don't think it's close to being as good as his earlier work, but it is one of his major books probably, so I had to mention it. And it does have some pretty effective dark scenes in it. I can't say it doesn't. Probably just didn't work as well for me, particularly considering how powerful a lot of his earlier stuff was. So yeah, I guess that's all I have to say about Richard Matheson today. Definitely a writer you want to check out. Like I said, if you've never read this guy, you need to. Particularly if you're interested in science fiction and fantasy and horror. do yourself a favor, check out Richard Matheson. And like I said, the place to start would be that collection of short stories, The Best of Richard Matheson. Excellent, excellent book. I did a whole video on that. Did I mention it? Probably. I've gone on and on and on. Okay, guys, that's all I have to say for today. I will catch you next time.